I think we've got a couple more people to pop in, but I'm just going to start making my little introductions. We have some wonderful people who are joining us for the second, third, or fourth time with this collaboration that myself, Allison, and Mike are doing or have been doing. We also have some newbies, so I'll just start all over and introduce myself as well. My name is Gina. I am one half of WINECULT and Riviera Wine Group. My other half is Aaron Lober. He's in another bubble in our living room. And we started Riviera Wine Group, which we're switching over to WINECULT shortly with a rebrand, which is really exciting. We started Riviera Wine Group 2.5, 3 years ago, and we are an online wine club and wine shop. And when COVID hit, we pivoted. We were doing all in-person events, and we switched over to doing all kinds of events online, and stumbled into this fantastic collaboration with Allison, who's the owner of Please the Palate, and Mike, who is the creator of Wine Weirdos. To give you a little bit more information about them, Allison, she owns Please the Palate, which is a agency that specializes in marketing and event planning. She's a columnist for the Napa Valley Register. She's a host of the podcast called Wine Soundtrack USA and a co-host of the video series called Crush on This. She's amazing, has clearly a lot going on. And she met Mike, who, like I said, is the creator of Wine Weirdos. The Wine Weirdos are 1 minute videos of wine reviews that help you discover unique wines from all over the world. And those can be found on YouTube, Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook. And Allison and Mike hooked up and started working on videos together. He's got a number of other wine weirdos that he does videos with. But Allison brought in a nice new fresh perspective from everything.
I'm the least weird of the wine weirdos.
I think you're pretty weird.
That's for sure. Yeah.
So I was just super excited to meet these guys and start this collaboration. The very first virtual tasting we did was about weird wines, which seems very fitting. And then we started doing these class series, which focuses on unique wines found all over the world, which is a really fun stretch for me because my company, Riviera Wine Group, we focus specifically on California wine. But since this collaboration and a number of the other virtual tasting solutions that we've been doing, we have since expanded, and now we have wines from all over the world available in our shop. And it's just, I feel like I'm learning right along with a lot of you guys. And so this class series is different than the last. The last is Old World wine. And this class series, we're going to be focusing on some wines of the Southern Hemisphere. We've got lots of other themes coming up for future series, but we really wanted to focus on some different wines, not specifically New World per se, but wines of the South. So they're lucky. It is summer there in Australia, which is the wines we're drinking tonight. Although I don't know, for whoever's in California, if you're getting this heat wave like we are, it's 85 degrees up here right now. So I feel like it's summer too.
It was 91 here.
Oh my God.
He's in Long Beach, like you, Jeanette.
Yeah. So tonight we're going to be tasting Australian wines. Alice and Mike, do you want to say anything else about yourselves before we hop in?
Not I.
No, just I'm excited because when we started this, we started with a unique wines that we brought, and then we did rethinking European, and now we're going Southern Hemisphere and up our sleeves. Can I tease it now? Because I'm just so excited. We're going to do old world and go to like Georgia, Croatia, Slovenia, maybe, what was our last one? Georgia, Croatia, Slovenia, and Armenia. Yeah. And then we're also we're looking at doing one to do Southern, South America and Mexico, to go to Argentina, Chile, and Baja. So we're working hard to find really cool wines to share with you guys. So
yeah. But so for tonight, I hope everyone has your food pairings prepared. Maybe I heard that some people were making the recipe suggestions that I put in the email. That tickles my heart. And I'm sure the pairings are fantastic. I have made both recipes, but I have not necessarily paired them with these specific wines. So I hope my sensory spidey senses that were tingling were correct with those pairings. We're just gonna hop right in. And before I get started, now that we're done with these introductions, for anyone who's new to these tastings, I want to say that this is casual, it's informal. We want you to interrupt us if you have questions. Please don't wait for us to start telling you about the wine tasting notes to drink. Please, I hope you're already all drinking. It's Friday and we're just here to have fun. So like I said, please interrupt us. There will of course be time for questions at the end. If you want to save your questions, but you really don't have to. We're just excited about the wines and we hope you are as well.
Cool.
All right, yeah, let's get started. So
Australian history.
Mike's gonna start.
Anybody up for a little history? Yeah, please drink while I tell you about Australia, because the thought of you all sitting on your hands while I say all this information is scary. So drink, drink, drink. If you like what I'm saying, drink. If you don't like what I'm saying, take a drink. Some general info about Australia. It's roughly the size of the United States. It's the 6th largest producer of wine in the world. And like the US, wine is produced in every Australian state, but it's mainly produced in the southern ones with the cooler climate. New South Wales, Victoria, and South Australia make up the vast bulk of wine that is produced there. And more recently, there has been more wine made in Tasmania, which is the island to the south of Australia, and in Western Australia in a region called Margaret River near Perth. Unlike Europe and the Americas, Australia does not have native grapes, so vines have to be imported from another region. More than 70 varieties are grown in Australia, and the most produced are Shiraz, Cabernet Sauvignon, Chardonnay, Merlot, Semillon, which we're having tonight, Pinot Noir, Riesling, and Sauvignon Blanc. And more recently, there's been an increase in some sort of surprising varieties popping up, Tempranillo, Vermentino, Fiano, which is an amazing white wine from Sicily, Nero d'Avola, Sangiovese, and Pinot Gris, among many others. So to get into the history, Australia was founded January 1st, 1901, but that was long after it became a British colony and settlement, and it's primarily intended to be a penal colony. They were also in sort of a race with France and other European nations to sort of see who could settle the world the quickest in the late 1700s, as most of you are probably aware. Captain Arthur Phillip introduced grape vines to Australia in 1788 on the first fleet, and by 1791, Phillip had planted 3 acres near Sydney. At one point, Phillip sent an official request to the British government to send some wine experts along. So they found 2 French prisoners. They offered them freedom and sent them out there, assuming that since they were French, they must know a lot about wine. And the results were not very good. One of them was sent back almost immediately, and the other tried to make cider out of peaches instead of apples, so did not end well. So they kind of had to make do on their own and figure it out themselves to some extent. Let me scroll down here. Sorry, I have 2 computers and 2 mouses working here. Sorry, got lost here.
would that be mice, Mike? Mouses, mice?
Oh yeah, I have 2 mice here. Nevertheless, the Australians persisted, okay? J.A. McIntyre explained in his lengthy PhD thesis, I read this is actually kind of interesting. If you want to geek out on something, let me know and I'll get the link to you. His thesis was called A Civilized Drink and a Civilizing Industry. And he said that while winemaking was not a particularly profitable industry in the early days, quote, advocates of the cultivation of wine grapes believed wine growing embodied beneficial, even transformative cultural value capable of creating order in a wild or savage landscape, end quote. So there was sort of this, I think what he posits is there's sort of this like sensibility that the English wanted to bring of civility, and with that came making and drinking wine to this totally new sort of harsh land that they were moving in on. So that was part of what was going on. Phylloxera hit Europe in the 1860s and traveled to Australia around 1875. And because Australians had just imported and begun planting numerous European varieties, they were severely affected. There were many regions, though, I was reading, that were not affected poorly, Hunter Valley being one of them. And I think we figured out that Tyrrell's, Allison will tell you about later, has been around so long, partially because they avoided phylloxera there. So that's interesting. South Australia imposed quarantines right away, and they were able to also save almost all of their vines. And that's when they became sort of the dominant winemaking, and still have been for very long. South Australia is the sort of huge southernmost region, with Adelaide down here in sort of the southeast corner, and tons of famous wine regions around there.
Mike, just
So,
to interrupt you, you mentioned phylloxera. Can you or Allison just give like a super quick intro on what phylloxera is and what it did to the entire world's wine industry?
Not just what it did, what it does.
Yes, true.
I can jump in while Mike clears his throat. Phylloxera is a little bug that gets into the vines and kills it. And Europe, well, the joke is that we gave it to Europe and then we saved Europe from it. So it eats the rootstocks, it eats the vines, and it killed vineyards all around the world. And the US industry was demolished by it as well. It is American rootstock that actually is persistent and doesn't get affected by it. So we gave American rootstock to the Europeans, and now most French, Italian, Spanish vines are all planted with American rootstock at the very bottom. That said, regions that have really sandy soils, parts of Spain, Santorini in Greece, these places with sand, phylloxera and sand are not friends. So those are the regions where they might tell you that they have 100, 200-year-old vines, and they really have, because phylloxera avoided it. But again, phylloxera is not the only disease, and there are a lot of others that vineyards are constantly dealing with. And right now, Temecula, I believe, was the most recent region to be affected by phylloxera. So they're in the process of pulling up and replanting a lot of stuff.
Awesome. Another quick question before Mike goes on. Brad and Stacy, they posted, I'll make sure that everyone's questions, if you have questions, you can post them in the chat. Brad and Stacy said, so I'm a nerd, aren't we all? And have been reading about the impacts of the wine, beer, and spirits industry, particularly beer and culture. Can you share the thesis title once more? I think that's to you, Mike.
Yes. Yeah, and I have the link as well. I can email to you.
We'll get all of the recommendations out in another email following this. So if you wanted to buy more wine, if you want to listen to any of the recommendations that any of us shout out, I keep a tab.
Just real quick, it's J.A. McIntyre, and it's a PhD thesis he did at the University of Sydney in 2008. And the short title of it is A Civilized Drink and a Civilizing Industry. And then there's some longer title that goes with it. It was really interesting. I didn't read all of it, but it's like 300 pages long or something, but it's really nerdy and interesting and goes into great detail. He only covers up to like 1901, up until Australia becomes its own country. So it's kind of interesting. It was phylloxera. All that said, it did not have as big of an impact on Australia as it had on other countries. There were many good regions that used the right rootstock or had quarantine process and did not get troubled by it. And as a result, in the 1870s, they started sending their wine to Europe. And at the 1873 Vienna exhibition, French judges praised wines from Victoria, but then they withdrew their remarks when they discovered that the wines were Australian and not French. And the judges protested on the grounds that, quote, wines of that quality must clearly be French. So they took away the award from them. But the Australians remained unfazed. And in 1878, a Shiraz from Victoria in the Paris exhibition was likened to Chateau Margaux and was described as, quote, a trinity of perfection. And gold medals were also granted in 82 in Bordeaux and again in 1889 in Paris. So Australian wine was already starting to get a notability to it. However, all said, post-phylloxera, there was sort of a dark age of wine, seems to be the general consensus at this point in Australia. You mainly found sweet and fortified wines. And the government was making efforts. For instance, in 1914, they created a vast irrigation area between South Australia and Victoria. And that region still produces tons of Australia's sort of bulk wine, as it were today. One second.
This is much longer than a 1 minute wine video.
It is, yeah. So moving into moving into the 20th century, post-war, thanks to a booming economy and a renewed social interest in wines, which included interest from sort of a new immigrant population coming in from Italy and Greece. They were used to having table wine, a dry wine on the table, not these sweet fortified wines that they were commonly making and serving there. And in 1960s, a shift occurred in Australian winemaking, and the focus turned from these fortified wines to table wines. Australian wine production was 1 million cases of table wine in 1960, and then it was 85 million by 1999. So during this period between 1960 and 2000, there was a massive jump in production of table wine in Australia. It was during this period that they had to be very innovative in Australia. They don't have water, so they had to figure out sort of these irrigation schemes on a sort of massive level. They do have tons of sun and tons of energy, but they don't have a lot of labor, so they have to really figure out ways to do sort of crazy mechanization, rather than just have hand labor. Like in California, we just have tons of people, to do the work. So that's not an issue. But in Australia, apparently there's a labor shortage when it comes to this sort of stuff. And so mechanization, irrigation are a big part of what they do there. And they created cask wine, otherwise known as box wine, in Australia during this period. And they also, a fellow ran Yalumba was the one who wanted to have them make screw caps, which both of our wines tonight have. So interesting thing that Australia is known for. Let's see here. Talked about irrigation. Okay, so by the late 1980s, Australian wine had burst onto the international market, especially in America and in Great Britain. Riding on the wave of Australian international promotion. Like if you remember, there was the shrimp on the Barbie ads in the 80s. That was kind of this Australian tourism thing. And at the same time, they won the America's Cup, the yacht race, and that was a big deal all over Time magazine and whatnot. So there was sort of this international acclaim to Australia. And as a result, you could start to find their wines more commonly available. Shiraz, as it turns out, was being used already to make these sort of sweet fortified wines. So it was sort of a moment of serendipity when Shiraz sort of transitioned into just being a really good table wine, and they started, creating, using that same grape to create, I think what we're going to have tonight, you're going to see as a terrific example of what they do now. In 2020, Australia was the world's 5th largest wine exporter, with more than 60% of the country's wine exported, and a lot of that goes to China. They have quite a taste for Australian Shiraz. And I think Jancis Robinson explains it well when she says, Australia has remarkable geological and climatic diversity, which can deliver as broad a spectrum of aromas and flavors as anywhere else in the wine producing world. It comes as no surprise, therefore, that small volume terroir focused wines are increasingly championed. And that is it. That's my presentation. Thank you.
Well, I'm going to pick it up and move into one of these smaller brands. It's not tiny. I mean, they're a larger producer. But when we talk about that shift, what Mike stood away from talking about was that thing called Yellowtail and, all those other animal brands that Australia became so famous for. And one of the things that Wine Australia and all the small producers that are making phenomenal wines are trying to say is we make quality wine in Australia. We make really quality wine. You just have to pay more than $5.99. So we paid more than $5.99 to bring you these. You can pay anywhere from, $20 to $80, but you have to get your mind around spending $80 on Australian wine, because that is just not what you're used to when you see it on sale at 7-Eleven. So Tyrrell's. Tyrrell's, when we think of Australia, we think of Australia as the New World. Their old world is France and Italy or Croatia and on that I mentioned before. But the reality is that Australia has been making wine for a long time, and this winery, Tyrrell's, is more than 160 years old. But as I was reading their history, it's sort of insane. And I wrote a few notes because I'll never remember these years. But basically, the family history starts in England in the early 1000s when Walter Tyrrell arrived in England with William the Conqueror. So we are going way, way, way back. And there is a story that the son of William the Conqueror, King William Rufus II, was killed by an arrow shot by Sir Walter Tyrrell in 1100 AD. And he fled England to live in Normandy until he was later pardoned by another king. So a few generations later, William Tyrrell, this is about 1807, was the first bishop of Newcastle in Australia. And then over the centuries, there have been more Williams, more Timothys in the Tyrrell family. And I can't tell you how many Timothys have married Elizabeths between the 1700s and 1800s. I mean, you could go to their website where they have a whole laundry list, and literally you'll read them and be like, Timothy married Elizabeth. And you're like, wait, I just read that. Oh, that's 100 years later. That's 50 years later. So it's a little insane. But in 1858, Edward Tyrrell, and I can't even tell you the chain of family at this point, took up a selection of 320 acres in Hunter Valley. It was actually at that time one of the last available properties. Because of the limestone soils, a lot of people had already picked up that land. And so they started building a winery. In 1863, the winery was built, and their very first vintage was 1864. Edward is considered the first generation, even though he's centuries into the family name. So Edward married a Susan, and they had 10 children, and then each of those kids married and had 8 or 10 children, and it kept going and kept going. In 1871, Edward George Young Tyrrell, who went by the name Dan, and I have no idea where Dan came from, but Dan started his first vintage in 1889. And this is really where the winery started to pick up its notoriety. Back in the 1940s, by the time we get there and we're in Dan's family's line, they were doing everything by horses, and it would take them 7 weeks to plow the vineyards. So if you don't have labor today and it took 7 weeks for horses, you can understand why machines had become very, very helpful. Dan had never married, and it went on to one of his nephews who took on the winery, and they proceeded to win award after award after award. They've been named the winemaker of the year. They've won the Olympics of the wine in France, and they have been, their first export to the US was in 1972 with 1,000 cases. By the early 2000s, they were up to 500,000 cases a year. So again, not a small winery. But we jump into the wines that we have today, and knowing that this is an award-winning winery, based on their inheritance, they started with 60 acres and today have 900 acres. And their primary, all premium vineyards are based in the Hunter Valley, which is in Southern Australia. But they've also started to expand out into other regions. So tonight we're going to go into, we're going to stay in Hunter Valley, and then we're going to move out into Victoria for our second wine. So the first wine that you've all been drinking, I hope, is Semillon. And this comes from the Hunter Valley. And as Mike had mentioned, the Hunter Valley was spared the phylloxera epidemic that had wiped out so many of the vineyards in Europe and as well as Australia. And so Hunter Valley is home to some of the oldest vineyards in the world. There are, in fact, the Tyrrells own a couple plots where they have vines that are over 100 years old, which is always a really amazing thing to taste old vines. So Hunter Valley is also home to some of the first commercial vineyards of Australia. And what it is most known for is Semillon, because of its citrus-driven, mineral-rich, age-worthy wines. The region is somewhere with really warm summer nights. They have nice cool breezes. It's surprising because we think of Australia as hot, that Hunter Valley is sort of an anomaly. It's a cooler climate area. And that's what is so great for grapes like Semillon and why we're not going to have our Shiraz from there. So the vines in Hunter Valley were planted by the Tyrrells in 1859. And today they have 304 acres in the Hunter Valley. As I said, it's a warm maritime climate. You've got sandy alluvial loam soils, some volcanic soils for the red wines. And they grow Shiraz and Chardonnay, Semillon, Pinot Noir, and Trebbiano. So I'm just trying to think if there's anything. I know that Gina's going to tell you a little bit about Semillon, and I'll jump back in afterwards about the wine and then Shiraz. You're muted, Gina.
Thank you. I'm going to share my screen with you guys really quickly. If you don't have the tech sheet that I emailed you, this is what it is. Oh, no, not that one. Sorry, guys. There we go. Can you guys see that, the map? Good. Okay. So this is the tech sheet that I sent everyone, but if you don't have it open, I just wanted to point out how massive Australia is and how little bits of Australia wine is actually grown in. And this really makes Mike's point that he made earlier about like, there's so much space and so many people. And of course, most of the people are located around the coastal regions, but how important the mechanization is of getting these massive plots of land and how to actually pick all of the grapes from the vines that they planted is a huge issue. And zooming in to, I'm going to stop sharing that now. I also attached the tech sheet into the chat if anyone needs to reference that as well. But one of the just most interesting things about that is how big Australia is. And I wish, do either of you guys know how many like Californias could fit in Australia? I wish I could find that stat. If anyone figures that out, I'd love to know.
Californians, because you can pretty much fit a United States in Australia.
I know. I like weird number stats like that. Someone find that out. It's homework for next time.
I've been to Australia, and I know my friend Kathy's been to Australia because we have friends that live there. And one of the things about Australia is when people go and they're like, oh, I'm going to go here, 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 and here, is like coming to the United States and saying, we're landing in New York, we're going to go to San Francisco, then we're going to go to New Orleans, we're going to Chicago, and then we're going to end in LA. And you're like, you do realize that that's a lot of flying. Like, so.
Oh my God. Brad and Stacy says 19 Californias. I hope that's true. Thank you guys.
They beat Ryan, who is trying to desperately do this math right now.
And is it, I'm sorry if I mispronounce your name, is it Rigo? And Matt also chimed in first, so they're confirming what we found.
You guys are amazing. That was the weirdest question for me to ask you guys, and you totally came through. Thank you. That is forever in my brain. 19 Californias in Australia. Thank you. So a little bit more about this wine that we're drinking. Semillon is such a cool, mind-blowing wine because it's as full-bodied as wines like Chardonnay. I would dare say Roussanne, although I'm sure some people would argue with me. But it doesn't taste like those two wines at all. It tastes a lot more like Pinot Grigio and Sauvignon Blanc. So it's got this like nice, awesome structure that has some really beautiful, lighter bodied flavors. So it really trips me up. I feel like I don't drink enough Semillon to be able to pick it out from a blind lineup, but the more I drink it, I feel like it's such an important grape for people to understand, and it's so rarely drank, especially here in California, because of course we're all obsessed with Sauvignon Blanc and Chardonnay and some of the other more popular ones. But just a little bit about Semillon in general. Like I said, it's got that really nice full-bodied characteristic, but has lighter, fruitier notes. It is a little bit thicker skinned than some thinner skinned grapes, such as like Pinot Grigio or some grapes that grow more classically in cooler regions. So it does have the ability, similar to Syrah or Shiraz, like we're drinking next, that it has the ability to grow both in cool and hot climates. So you get these two different expressions of the same grape that I wish we had two Semillons from a hot region and a cool region together, because they would taste completely different, which is fantastic and really fun to experience. Also really fun to do with Syrahs as well, but we'll get into that later. So this specific Semillon is coming from a cooler climate, Hunter Valley. And so cooler climate Semillons, you get a lot more acidity and taste a lot more like Sauvignon Blanc. So if you're confused, if you're thinking this is a Sauvignon Blanc, you're not alone. It is much more similar to Sauvignon Blanc than a hot climate Semillon would be. Go ahead.
Can I just jump in real quick?
Yeah.
One of the things to know is that Semillon is the third most planted white grape in France. And you might not know it, but Semillon is typically blended with Sauvignon Blanc, because when you talk about white Bordeaux is usually a Semillon Sauvignon Blanc blend. And then Semillon, which you're probably going to touch on, is also made in a lot of sweet wines. So Sauterne is a Semillon based wine, and a lot of sweet wines. So yeah, it is a real nice companion to Sauvignon Blanc in a blend.
Exactly. Yeah, I have another wine in my current wine shop. It's a Chateau Canteladette from Bordeaux, and it is a white blend. It's 90% Semillon, 10% Sauv Blanc, and it's just such a great departure, next step. If you want to branch out from Sauvignon Blanc, it's such a great start to kind of start with that blend, and then maybe go into something that is 100% Semillon like this. So other regions that cool climate Semillons come out of, my research said Bordeaux, although I would argue with that, because I think Bordeaux is a little bit warmer. Maybe Allison or Mike, you can confirm.
Bordeaux is warmer than a Burgundy, but they have it gets cooler at night, and they do get cold winters, but it is a warmer area. It just has a water influence because of the rivers that run through. So it's not a continental climate.
Gotcha. Okay, thank you.
Yeah, and well, I wanted to say Santa Barbara County.
Yeah,
right,
well, yeah,
Allison?
yes, very true. I hadn't finished my list. So Bordeaux, Hunter Valley, Australia, which is where this wine is, Western Australia, Washington State, and then my list doesn't say California, but that is an excellent point. Here in California, we have such unique microclimates that range from very cold, closer to the ocean, to very hot. So we can pretty much grow every single grape variety that exists in the world, which is really fun. And there are some good examples of California Semillon as well. Yeah, oh, and then another fun little flash forward to our third class in this series, we're going to be tasting South African wines. And I wanted to point out that in 1820, or in the 1820s, Semillon covered 93% of the country's vineyard area and was referred to as, oh my gosh, I'm going to pronounce Wijndroof, which just meant wine grape. So it is so easily grown that it can take up that much space. And I'm really happy that we've kind of honed in on the best regions where Semillon is growing today. And so we get to experience something like this. So I wanted to talk more about just briefly the warmer climate Semillons. You get a lot more of those riper fruit notes like mango, yellow, peach, papaya. I don't get those at all on this wine. So this wine specifically, and of course everyone has their own palate, everyone's going to be tasting something differently, but I get a lot more citrus flavors like lemon, lime zest, grapefruit, And then maybe even as it's starting to warm up, a little bit more like lemon curd, something a little bit fattier, but not necessarily as much as you would experience in like a Chardonnay.
Yeah, and to Ryan and Melanie's question, I would say that the different Semillon has lower acidity than Sauvignon Blanc, and it tends to have kind of a little heavier mid palate. Not that this one is, you know, low in acidity and heavier, but if you compare it, Sauvignon Blanc has higher acidity levels. It's a lighter bodied wine, and that's kind of the main difference. The aromas are pretty similar, at least in a young Semillon. Compared to a Sauvignon Blanc, the aromas are pretty similar.
Yeah. And then Rigo and Matt asked what areas are cool and warm Semillon. A warmer climate Semillon, that's California, South Africa, Argentina, and South Australia. And like I said, with cool climate Semillons, that's Bordeaux, Hunter Valley, which is where this wine is from, Western Australia, and Washington State, and also California, because we have so many different microclimates here.
And the other thing is when Gina had mentioned like putting 10% in with Sauvignon Blanc in Bordeaux, what Semillon does is it gives the wine structure, and it gives it that kind of that linear focus and that mouthfeel structure that you want in wine. So that's where it enhances Sauvignon Blanc, and I think we can taste it in this wine.
It's known for having sort of an oilier quality to it, and I think in Bordeaux Blanc it especially has more of that. I think this is a little bit kind of that riper. I could see where people are saying this is similar to Sauvignon Blanc, but I think Allison made a good point about this when we were tasting it earlier, which was they spend some time on the lees, right? So I think it does have some of that yeasty character to it, which I think gives it a little more heft than your typical Sauvignon Blanc.
Yeah, I think the time on the lees, it's not so much on the notes that you're getting on aromas or taste, but that mouthfeel, that kind of chalky roundness that you feel, you know, I think comes from the time it spends on the yeasts aging. And I think this wine has just such great angularity, but also kind of roundness.
It really allows you to pair it with so many different things. Like, and even if you're drinking it, like intentionally drinking it at different temperatures, when it's colder, of course, you've got a lot more of those like sharp, high acid feelings in your mouth. But as it starts to warm up, I've now had this wine in my glass for about 45 minutes, as we all have. And it's just kind of softening, and it's getting a lot more welcoming to some more of those like buttery notes. Like maybe I would have like a really buttery pastry with it or something like that. Or a creamy pasta.
Yeah, I think at room temp is where this wine really shines. I think it's terrific at room temp. I actually opened mine last night, and it doesn't mind air. Like, I think this will be great tomorrow as well. And I think at room temp, it's fantastic. And this wine is ageable. Like they talk about, I mean, Tyrrell's Hunter Valley Semillon is actually a thing. It's like kind of a nerdy wine. And like people like talk, I mean, I've had this in different restaurants before and ordered off the list, you know, which is kind of ridiculous, you know, but it's just like a great wine with all sorts of food. And
well, and for anyone who joined us for our earlier tasting when we did Portuguese wine and you tried the Encruzado, and if you've had a Sirtico from Greece, one of the things that we talked about and that I love about these two grapes is that Encruzado has beautiful aromas and tastes like a Chablis now, but has all this great aging potential. And I've mentioned like a Sirtico is just mineral acidity. I wouldn't even say citrus notes. And as it ages, a wine that's never seen oak or anything takes on these nutty nutty kind of caramely characteristics. And Semillon is very much like that. As Semillon ages, it takes on a lot more kind of rounder, nuttier qualities. And I mean, not that you can compare it, but when you think about a sweet wine made with Semillon, all those characteristics of caramel and nuts, that's what aged Semillon does. So you can enjoy it young and crisp and, you know, sharp and linear, and you can enjoy it as it gets a little bit more round and interesting.
What do you guys think about the ageability? I know screw cap wines aren't necessarily meant to be put in the cellar forever, but while we're talking about Australian wines that this grape is almost meant to be aged for a long time. What is the ageability with a screw cap for a wine you want to put in the cellar for 20 years?
It's actually a misnomer that you cannot age wine in a screw cap. There is still, I mean, a screw cap doesn't breathe the way a cork does, which can add to your benefit. But there's a winemaker in Sonoma, Kathleen Inman, who's a Pinot producer, who jumped on the screw cap bandwagon many, many years ago and started producing the same Pinots and putting half under cork and half under screw cap to see what would happen. And she found that her screw cap wines aged just as well and with no problems, and were not stunted in any way by it. So, you know, if you open up your wine fridge and happen to have a screw cap Semillon from 2012, don't be afraid, it might be good. My Sauvignon Blanc from 2009 under cork is probably not good though. But yeah.
Don't assume that. I had a 1970 Mondavi Fumé Blanc, which is Sauvignon Blanc, and it was freaking unbelievably terrific. However, they did make their wine differently back then too, so.
Yeah, but screw caps are an interesting thing. I was surprised to know that the Australians invented it, because New Zealand was really the country that was infamous for putting everything under screw cap. And I know Australia puts almost everything under screw cap as well. It's just a new world mentality, you know. Just people don't think it's as sexy to open. You know, you have to find the video of the sommelier who knows how to roll it off his arm and make a sound and make it very fancy so that it impresses the customer.
I like that. Does anyone have any questions? I feel like this is an appropriate time to move on to our Shiraz, but if you have any questions, any thoughts, any fun food pairings that you're experiencing right now, feel free to shout out.
Chicken. Goes well with fried chicken.
Okay, yes it would.
So that pasta recipe, it's really easy to make. It's super delicious, even if you're not drinking the wine with it. And the wine was really good with it. Just so you know, it was super good.
Awesome. I will save
Everybody should try that recipe.
Well, I mean, it would make sense because the creaminess of that pasta with scallops, or I know you did shrimp, that creaminess would be cut through with the acidity. And the same with fried chicken, that oily texture, even if it's crisp, the sharpness of the wine would be contradicting it, or, you know, fighting it in a good way. Fighting is not the right way. They're not harmonious. They're sort of, they work together. They integrate.
It was
Counterpoint.
good.
Counterpoint.
Thank you.
You're a writer,
I don't know
Allison.
what you all just said, but it was delicious.
I've been in proposal mode. I have to get my writing hat back on.
All right, guys. Well, no pressure on finishing this glass or this bottle. If you have a second glass ready to start enjoying the Syrah, we will pop back over. Mike, do you have any other kind of Syrah related, or Shiraz? Wow, I'm on a Syrah kick right now. Related historical country overview, or should we pop directly over to Allison?
I don't. I mean, just what I said before, which was that they had tons of it already growing as a result of they were making this fortified wine forever, and then they just kind of switched over to making table wine, and they were like, wow, this works great. That's essentially what I learned, you know, in layman's terms. But I'm sure there's a lot more interesting things going on. I actually am captivated by this wine, and I think that with air, it has done great things. Allison and I had great controversy over it earlier, which was fun, and I've changed my thinking. I think it's tremendous wine. But I mean, this is Tyrrell's as well, right?
Mm-hmm.
I suppose you'll talk about Heathcote and Victoria, right?
Yeah, well, I'll start with Shiraz. There's a funny story that I was always told. I don't know if this is 100% true, but I think it sounds good, so I'm gonna go with it. So as Mike had said, you know, it was a penal colony, and the French were, I mean, they were planting grapes, and the story goes that they hated their motherland so much, or the English hated the French so much, they wouldn't want to call it Syrah, the French way. So they called it Shiraz, which is the capital of Iran, and they wanted to do it as a thumb in the nose to the thing. But, and I'm going to say something that a few people have heard already, because Stacy and Rico and Matt heard this, and I'm going to steal Chris's analogy because I thought it was a good one the other night. But Shiraz is a different clone than Syrah. They are related. They are the same, but they're clones. Just like you would have, Pinot has different clones. All grapes kind of manifest. They have the same DNA, but they change based on where they're planted and where they're grown. And then when you take a replanting from a new place, it changes over time. And the other night in a blind tasting we had a Shiraz from California, and they specifically had the clone from Australia. And my friend likened it to this. If you had twins born in New York City, identical twins born at the same time, same hospital, same parents, everything same, their DNA, and you took one baby, put them in Japan, and you took the other one and put them in Norway, and the two of them grow up, DNA-wise, they're identical, but they've grown up in different cultures and under different circumstances, and they're a little bit different. And I was thinking back to, I had mentioned, like, when you had the movie about the triplets that were separated at birth, and when they found each other, they found they had all these common characteristics, and yet they had different cultural things. And I think that's where you say with Shiraz and Syrah, you've got two different grapes that have grown up on two different continents originally. And as they've grown up, they're different, but at the base of it, they share more common traits. They just now have branched out a little bit. So that's my Shiraz story, but don't quote me on that. We hate the French, so we call it Shiraz, but that's the story I was always told.
Yeah, I would believe that story. I worked the World Equestrian Games in Normandy, and the French and the English, they still were ragging on each other all the time. It was really pretty funny.
Yeah, the French and the English don't like each other. The Aussies and the Kiwis don't like each other. Oh, I take that back. The Aussies feel about the Kiwis the way Americans and Canadians used to feel about each other. Where Canadians would run around with their flags and we would mock them because they put them on their backpacks. Now we all want to put them on our backpacks. Yeah. Anyway, this Shiraz, so Tyrrell, as I mentioned, has been around for almost 200 years, 160 plus years. They are based in Hunter Valley, but they've expanded into other regions, and they went into Victoria, into Heathcote. And this is considered kind of Australia's gold country. And it's known for making some of the country's best red wines. You've got rolling countryside, you have ancient reddish brown soils, which are volcanic based. And then you also have mountain ranges, and then you have cool air that comes in during the growing season. And so that not only adds to the growing, but also that impressive dark hue that we get from Shiraz. So the Tyrrells have 65 acres of vineyards in central Victoria. It's a cool continental climate. And this is where the Shiraz really shines. This is an area that developed wine production in the 1950s, but it really started to expand in the 1980s. And now it's between a number of ranges, but best way to think of it is that it's about 120 kilometers northwest of Melbourne. So I talked about that there are mountains, and you get a cool thing. You have alluvial floodplains. I mean, it is the perfect climate for full-bodied, rich, textured Shiraz, as well as Cabernet. And so they're always able to achieve full ripeness, even when the climate is moderate. I don't want to say too much because I know Gina's going to jump into the Shiraz. So let's see, the Heathcote. Okay, so this vineyard was planted in 1994. And it was fully planted out in completion in 1997. That was the same year they released the first one of this Rufus stone. And the Cambrian soils are just really key. That's the volcanic that I mentioned. And that is kind of it without me going too much into the Shiraz itself. So Gina, why don't you jump in here?
Yeah, we did lots of similar research, Allison. I won't repeat myself, or I won't repeat some of the stuff that you said, but that's great. A couple of other points that might not have explicitly been said. Syrah, or now Shiraz, did originate in the Rhone Valley in France. It is now the most widely planted grape in Australia, and can be found all over. I mentioned this earlier, but it's a nice, tough, thick-skinned grape, so it can grow in cooler climates and warmer climates. And then it also does have that kind of old world, new world tug going on. And so old world Syrahs, they make their wines in slightly different ways, with kind of different ideas of what they want the end product to be in mind. Old world is like European wine, so France, Italy, Spain, those other regions. New World is Australia, California, Washington, New Zealand, a lot of those other wine growing regions that popped up much more recently. And so Old World Syrahs, specifically from Italy and France, tend to have higher acidity and earthy herbaceous aromas. New World Syrahs, or like this Shiraz, come from Australia, the US, South America, which usually have more fruit-driven characteristics and lots of spice. So this specific Shiraz is really rich, very powerful. I really like this flavor. I threw it in a decanter like 3 hours ago, and it's just tasting so beautifully right now. A little bit of like a meaty characteristic. I did give you a wine pairing in the email that everyone should have received, which is a brisket, like a French onion soup inspired brisket, which is outstanding. I did pair it with the Syrah on Christmas, and it was amazing. I've been craving it ever since. But some other notes that I get on this, lots of like blueberry, blackberry, black pepper. It's just such an expressive grape or wine. And I do remember when I first opened it, I took a sip immediately, and it was pretty shut down. So if you opened it immediately before this tasting, I would definitely recommend throwing it in a decanter, or just kind of slowly sipping on it over the next day. It's really going to show you some really cool notes.
Yeah, it's got I love the mouthfeel on this. I mean, it has all those pretty notes, the dark red fruits and blue fruits, blueberry, blackberry. It's got dark cherry. We tasted this earlier because we were doing a video on it. I mean, I got Earl Grey tea notes, and I loved all that. But what I love on the palate is just how it kind of dances over it. It has sort of sandy, soft tannins that sit on the tongue and coat the tongue, and then this nice acidity with like kind of a mineral finish. And it's got this, I don't know, I just really enjoyed it. It makes me want to eat, which I was gonna have a cheese plate. I gave Kathy suggestions on cheeses and didn't manage to get them for myself, so.
Speaking of cheese, I was doing some reading specifically on Shiraz with cheese, and I've always intentionally just gone for like kind of a harder cheese, like an aged Gouda, to pair with a Syrah or a Shiraz. And I was reading that it's actually better to go with something softer with a much higher fat content because of how strong and how like intense Shiraz or Syrahs can be. And that makes total sense. You want to kind of go with the complement. So a much stronger thing, and not you don't want to get a cheese that's going to be totally overpowered, but something that's soft with a high fat content that has like a little bit of an aromatic quality to it, like kind of like a stinky brie or a blue cheese. Those would be specifically excellent pairings with this wine as well.
When you think about the tannins that are sort of a little gritty and drying, that fat would really soften it on the palate. So sorry, Brian.
Did you like that he raised his hand? Like,
okay, I don't want to interrupt. No, so this is weird, and you could tell me like how weird I am and nerdy. But when I smell this, I pick up a lot of like violets and like almost like tire smell, which makes me like almost want to like pick up like a Nebbiolo to like try to figure out like the differences between those two. Cause like Nebbiolo, like violet, tar, is it tar and roses or tar and violets?
Roses.
Tar and roses. So that's the difference, is that like the Shiraz is like more like the purple smell.
Yeah, definitely more of the purple. And I'm totally with you on kind of that violet aroma. I'm looking for the tires, but I mean, the more you smell, you pick up other things influenced by other people will help you find the aromas. I mean,
we also just opened it, so it could just be part of that.
I felt like it was, I don't know. I almost got like more of like the plasticky smell, but it's not in the taste at all. So it might be something to do with the bottle.
Well,
I got that on my first smell and then like could not get it again. So I know what you're talking about. And ours had been open for a little bit, but it was even like right after the first pour, there was a smell that I couldn't identify. And
swirl it out of your glass.
My bottle, I've had this bottle open since last night. It is much better the second day. It is light years better the second day. I don't want to discourage drinking, but if you can wait and drink this, the rest of it tomorrow, it came out of the fridge and it's just so much more going on for me. It was a little like monolithic and heavy and big at first on pop and pour and kind of some of that weird funky stuff going on. But now it's just amazing. And it does have more mineral quality to it on the nose and the palate the next day. And I almost get like kind of this freshness coming across more like a shiso leaf, like that green leaf that they give you when you have sushi. It just reminds me of that, but I'm a day later. I'm 24 hours ahead. So
you're light years ahead of us, Mike.
I'm light years ahead, but I am a day ahead on the Shiraz. It's really a great wine now. I love it. I think it likes air.
Well, I mean, I opened mine up, I guess, an hour and a half ago. And I've been adding more, and I've liked it from the moment I opened it. I just needed to give it a little swirl. So, I mean, it'll be interesting. I am not going to drink this all tonight. I am going to save it, and I'm going to try it again tomorrow just to kind of see where it is. Because
I think for me, like a truism would be that wines of quality, they're the ones you end up drinking the quickest because they're so good, but they're the ones that can stand the air. They could stand to be open for days and they'll just evolve and get better. So it's just kind of that problem. I'm getting that with both of these wines.
That's such a great point. That's like on those fantastic nights where we used to be able to be around people and have fun wine drinking parties. And you'd have this whole gorgeous lineup of wine. And then like, everyone's drunk by the end and you're like, I've got that amazing bottle that I've been wanting to open for years. And of course you're not tasting anything anymore, but you drink it and you don't even remember it.
You always drink the best wine first.
Yeah.
Now you just have to drink by yourself. So. Any other thoughts, questions, comments, observations? Recommendations? You're all so quiet.
So I've got a good,
I was just gonna say, I'm having dessert, so I'm a dark chocolate person too. And I bought this one at Whole Foods. I always call it Good Earth, but that was a restaurant. And it's black salt caramel.
Ooh.
And when I first tasted this, I thought, it's really dry and okay, it's, okay. And then when you guys are talking about the smelling, I said to him, I smell pepperoni pizza. That's what I smell. I smell tires. Anyway, but I did this and it totally mellowed the wine out. It was like, oh, this is really good.
Did you say it's dark chocolate or milk chocolate?
Well, it's 72% cacao and then it's caramelized.
Okay. Yeah.
So it has caramel. It's kind of gooey.
Yeah, the caramel. Yeah.
Yeah, so it's that heavy sugar butter.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
and it just smoothed it out. It was like, oh, this is really good wine.
Yeah, dark chocolate by itself, like just a bar of dark chocolate, when you have kind of the acidity and tannins of this, they don't fight, but they're not great. But the caramel, that creaminess is going to work with this.
Yeah.
And milk chocolate or a truffle of some sort that has flavors would work.
Some kind of cream. And I think it was the caramel that did that, because I ate a lot of extra dark chocolate. So I know sometimes it's bitter and then you're trying to push it down with red wine. It's like, well, that didn't really do anything. Tastes like chocolate and it tastes like wine. But when I mixed it together, it was like, oh, that's really good. So.
Mike, you had mentioned before, like you and Allison had an interesting discussion about this wine. What was your discussion, and she persuaded you, or what's the backstory?
I'll say it in the nicest of ways. He had a very opinionated opinion about the wine that wasn't positive. And my reaction was, is there something wrong with the bottle you had? Because to have such an extreme reaction, it's one thing to say it's not my style or I don't really like it. He went very far and I was like, oh God, like you must have a bad bottle. And he's like, it's not a bad bottle. I'm like, well, I don't.
But to be fair, I exaggerate. So I was exaggerating because I know that it was going to get her goat. So it did. So there was more going on. There were some dynamics that were not strictly about the wine. However, I was not in love with the wine, and now I'm quite smitten with it. I think it's terrific.
Go ahead.
Oh no, I was gonna say, I would have had no problem if the text I got was, I don't love the wine. I would have been like, yeah, like.
But that would have been no fun at all.
Mike and I are similar in the sense that we tend to prefer cool climate wines. Not that these aren't from cool climates, but cooler climates. We tend to like minerality and acidity. And if I hadn't tasted it yet, so if he had said to me, it's just not my style, I might have been like, we're going to get another big Shiraz and that was not the goal. That was not our plan, but oh well. Then I tasted and I'm like, this is really good. He changed his mind. So
it is really good. And it's gotten a lot better. I think it's terrific with air, especially. It's a good wine.
I think that's a great point for a lot of really great quality wine. And like you guys said earlier, these are not $5 bottom shelf grocery store wines. They are very intentionally made, gorgeous wines. And as it goes with some wines, they need a minute. There's this living gorgeousness in a bottle. And as soon as you open it, it's like, I mean, the Shiraz specifically, it's a 2016, so it hasn't seen air in now going on 5 years. And it's finally like after, like I said, I've been decanting this for the last 3 hours. It's finally like shaken off its, cellar close-offedness. And I really hope that everyone is able to save at least a glass of this for tomorrow if you opened up the wine tonight, because I think it's really, and we're all wine professionals here, I think it's really close-minded. And I'm sure this is what you guys were having this conversation about, to say, it's not my wine, I don't like it. And that's, I think, a common thing that everyone does, including myself. So it's funny that you guys had that whole discussion about the wine, and then now you're like, it's amazing, I love it, which is so very much like wine.
I also just came off of 2 nights of doing blind wine tastings, which a couple people here were on, and it was all about not judging a wine until you've, trying to figure out, like there's one part when you're properly going through tasting etiquette that says, is the wine poor, average, good, very good, excellent? And that's not the opportunity for you to say, I think it's poor. Is this wine a good example of what it should be? And that's the thing. It's one thing to say, I might not want to drink it, or this is my favorite wine, I want it every night. But if it's a sound wine for what it is, then we can get into whether or not we agree with what the winemaker did, or what the region is, or what the grape is, or, maybe
right. It's very objective. Either you start with, is the wine flawed or not? No, the wine is not flawed. And then you go from there. Is it varietally correct? Is it making sense from the region that it's from? Does it express that? Yeah, I understand. I mean, to what Gina was saying, it is true. That is the worst thing in the world, when you're texting with someone or hearing somebody had a wine and you ask them, oh, didn't you love it? And oh yeah, I opened that up, and then down the sink in 15 minutes. It's just like, no. It's like, what on earth are you doing? Like give it time. Like, why down the sink? Like, just try it the next day. Put it on your counter. I probably texted people that probably hundreds of times. Put it on the counter, let it rest, try it tomorrow.
Plus, try it with food. You never, ever, ever know that a wine that you may not like on its own, and this can go for a lot of Italian wines that are not meant to be sipped by themselves. A wine like this, I could sip this Shiraz, but I know it would be so much better with food. So much better.
So that's what I was gonna ask, because I feel like wines like this for me, like we just had it. Ryan grabbed when someone brought up chocolate. Good call. He went and grabbed something, and the chocolate just makes it taste so much better. And then so I can imagine just with like, this is like a steak wine to me. Like it's kind of like a Napa Cab. Like it can hold up to like a big steak, or like what Gina recommended, like the brisket. But do you, with something big like this, isn't with food pairing, like do you have any advice on that? Because isn't it hard, because you don't want to pair it with something that it's gonna like Gina was saying, like totally overwhelm, right?
So like besides barbecue, because barbecue could handle it, like what else would you pair this with?
I wouldn't do barbecue per se. Like it would depend. See, one of the biggest things to think about is the sauce you're doing. It's not so much the protein. When you read about pairings with Shiraz, it's not as much beef as it's recommended with lamb, duck, like meats, but not getting into the beef. And if I was going to do beef, I might do like a flank steak or something, but a
cheeseburgers. That would be amazing. I want a double with this.
In-N-Out and Shiraz.
Yeah.
Because the meats that Allison just mentioned and the cheeseburgers that Mike mentioned are like to me are like the caramel and that chocolate, because those are fattier meats than any of the beefs would be.
Yep. And that's the biggest thing, is when you have wines with tannins, you want fat. And when we say where it's the acid or the carbs with the protein. So you think about bigger red wines and they want meat. They want that fat. That's what softens them up.
Or we could say richness instead of fat. Fat sounds too ugly, but
yeah, but richness, but richness, I mean, I can think about doing a scallop dish, a buttered scallops, which is richer than I would call fatty.
That's what the buttered scallops we're going to say for the Semillon.
And buttered scallops, I would have something like a Semillon. I would have something like, or I would even go with a Chardonnay, depending on if I wanted to cut through the butter or harmonize with the butter. I mean, it's all of those choices. And ultimately what you're thinking about is how you're preparing it and the sauce you're putting on it. Because, the meat is an important part, but if you're putting barbecue tomato sauces on it, I would not do this with a tomato sauce.
So what I did too was, I just had one little square of this, and now it doesn't have the same taste that it did while I was eating that. So when I first tasted it, I thought, oh, this one's really dry. It's not, I mean, I like it, but it's not like some of the normal wines that I would just drink by themselves. As soon as I ate this, oh, wow, this wine's really good. Then it went away and I'm finishing up my little glass. And it's like, okay, here we go back to the dry. So it's like, you have to eat something.
Yeah,
with it. I would.
Even getting a piece of cheese would help. If you had a piece of Jack or cheddar cheese.
Something real greasy.
It's not the perfect thing, but it's the fat of the cheese or the protein that would soften the tannin part.
Right. And that's what I'm discovering by taking these classes. I didn't know all this. I just would stumble across it. Oh, the wine all of a sudden is good. And it's like, oh, that's why.
Well, tannins too, these tannins are, we've talked about this, the tannins are that drying sensation that you can get in a green banana or over soaking a tea bag. It's the skins of an apple have tannins in them.
Right.
But tannins run a gamut of descriptions. They can be really smooth and soft, and they can be grippy, they can be drying. And I would say in this wine, you have a moderately drying tannins, but they're still pretty soft. Mm-hmm. So it's not wiping your mouth out like with super dry tannins.
Yeah.
They add a nice texture to them, to the palate.
Right.
Something that I'm also really loving about this wine is when I first started to get really into wine, and Aaron can vouch for this, I really did not like Syrah. I would skip it on when we were out wine tasting, and I just generally had no interest in tasting it. Of course, that's the exact wrong thing to do when you're trying to find something and experience something and learn more about it. But of course, that was years ago, and this is now. And I often still come across some Syrahs that I don't love, but this specific Syrah I am really loving because it doesn't have that overpowering like smokiness that a lot of warmer climate Syrahs do. And I just love how soft this is. And that also goes to the tannins as well. It's of course not as soft as a Pinot Noir, but it's a Shiraz. It is a little bit, fuller bodied, it's got thicker skin, therefore more tannins. But I think it's an extremely well-balanced wine. And yeah, I'm excited to taste it day 2 too.
I was just starting to put a note in, but I'll say this, that first to Kathy's question about chilling it, to storing it. Yeah, you put the screw cap back on. The one thing to note is that if you are recorking a wine and putting in the fridge, you do want to rest it this way because you don't want the cork to dry out. But with the screw cap, it doesn't really matter. So you put it wherever it fits in the fridge because the screw cap's not going to dry out. So you don't have to worry about that. The other thing I was going to say is Mike had suggested chilling the red down a little bit, and I'm fully in favor of that. Mostly because if you're taking that red right off the shelf, it's not even at cellar temperature, it's at your room temperature, and 70 degrees is not wine temperature, that's body temperature room. So what I always suggest, if you don't have your wine in a wine fridge, because the refrigerator is too cold. So if you put your wine, if you have a red wine and you don't have a wine fridge to store it in, stick it in the refrigerator for 20 or 30 minutes before you want to drink it and then pull it out, it'll have a nice chill. Whereas your white wine, if your white wine's been in the regular refrigerator, take it out, leave it in there for however long. And when you take it out about a half hour before you want to drink it to let it warm up to a little more room temperature, because we tend to drink our whites a little too cold and our reds a little too warm. So
that's exactly what I was going to say. You probably all heard that before, but if you haven't, take it to heart, because when I learned that and started adjusting to it, it changed my wine drinking phenomenally and made my whites and reds much better.
Yeah, I just did a video with my friends on Crush on this about chilling red wines, because we're big fans of doing that. And some wines even some red wines do even better, as we tasted a couple of them in some of these tastings, like the Galliopo that we had done was really good with a chill on it. So,
Well, I don't want to, I'm definitely not ending this now. I'm not kicking anyone off, but I am mindful of everyone's time. We've been at this now for over an hour. Does anyone have any questions? Please, if so, throw them in the chat or interrupt us. Just a couple of notes. I know that I think everyone in this did purchase all 3, so we'll be in this together for the next month. But something that if you're new to this, we do send out a follow-up email with the recording of this in case you wanted to check back. Maybe you thought of or remembered something that we said, but you don't remember exactly. So we'll send out this recording, and we'll also include any recommendations. Mike, if you can make sure to include the thesis that you were talking about earlier. And then we do also have more of these available if you wanted to purchase more. If you just want more of either the Semillon or the Shiraz, I do have them available in the shop, and I'll also include those links as well. But yeah, this is really great. It's such a fun new round of wines. We've got New Zealand coming up next, Australia's rivalry. And we've got more people joining for that one too, which is fun because a couple people just bought New Zealand. Everyone was really jazzed about New Zealand, which I'm really excited about. So we've got some good wines there too. But yeah, we're still here. So I just wanted to give those couple pieces of notes. So in case you wanted to pop off, you're totally welcome to, but we're here until everyone's done asking questions. And then just to ask some questions that popped up in the chat, Rigo and Matt says, what is this recorking that you're talking about? fair. And then Mike says, yeah, I don't think mine will make it another hour. You've had yours open for 2 days, Mike. You're light years ahead of us.
Tina, I don't think ours is going to make it another hour.
I want to taste them tomorrow.
You put it in a decanter, in a beaker. You're just going to be drinking out of that soon.
How did you come across this winery? I might have missed that earlier, so I apologize, but how did you find?
I did. So when we picked the wineries, like, I've been sort of instrumental in pulling Gina out of Santa Barbara County. So the three of us came up with different regions we'd want to do. And I reached out to some importer friends whose portfolios I really respect. And we try to keep it in a price point because we're obviously not picking wines that are $60, which would be great because one of the challenges with Australia and New Zealand a little bit, not quite as much. Bye, Kathy. Not that Kathy with a Y, who said goodbye. The hardest thing is that we're trying to find a really good example in a price point that fits the budget that we're trying to do it at. And so Australia and New Zealand, we're trying to get out of that $5.99 mentality, and we're trying to get quality that isn't a $60 wine, if that makes sense. So
this is a really great like introductory price point. And yeah, so this like $25 to $37 price point, which is exactly where all of the wines for this class series land in. It's such a great kind of next step wine that won't break the bank, but is very easily attainable, and you won't really complain about, casually drinking a bottle. And then with that said, I forgot to mention, if you scroll to the very top of the chat, I included the links to the additional bottles, and I also included a coupon code for $5 off each bottle of wine if you want.
I think when someone jumps into it after you've posted it, they don't see earlier chats.
Oh, that's fine. I'll send it out in the email as well. Yeah. So you'll all get it tomorrow morning.
But so those guys still wanted to know about recorking. Answer but it doesn't apply here because we have screw cap wines,
and they're also going to finish it, or they've finished it.
Yeah, but recorking is if you have I can never get the actual cork back in the bottle. That's why I have those.
Turn the cork upside down.
Oh, okay. That's why
they saw the tasting was 2 bottles of wine in an hour, and they were like, "That's us. Let's do it." And they're wondering what's wrong with us.
But that's why I have those. What are they? Those plastic corks that you have the thing that takes the air out.
Yeah, I mean there are a lot of different things you can use. I just think that any sort of not aeration, but what are the companies with the
Corvin?
No, not Corvin. More of the sprays, like the CO2 that you spray in. You are putting a nice layer. Like right now, my line is right here and oxygen got in here. So I'd want to put a layer of CO2. That's the point of them. You don't want oxygen to get in. But all it's really doing is preserving the quality of the wine for the next couple of days. It's not extending it. If you think about it this way, wine is like a flower. When you go to the store and you buy a flower, it may not have come out of its bud yet, or it might have been bloomed. You take it home and it's beautiful. And by day 2 and day 3 and by day 4, you still leave it on the kitchen table, but it's starting to look a little sad. By day 5 or 7, it might still be on your kitchen table. It does not look like day 1, but you still do. And wine's like that. Wine's like a flower. Some wines take a day or 2 to open up. Like some flowers will take a day or 2 to open up. But really, after 4 days, they're just sort of starting to not open up anymore. So you can still enjoy the wine. It will not kill you to drink it. It just won't be as good as the earlier days. It loses some of its freshness.
Wow, that was really well said. That is so true. I'm completely drunk at this point, but that was terrific.
I just ask a super quick question in advance of the New Zealand. Oh, sorry. Is there anything that you think really sets New Zealand and Australia apart from each other?
Sorry.
A lot sets them apart.
So sneak the like maybe the biggest thing that you think is really different.
Well, I mean, when you think of Australia, you think of Shiraz, and then Semillon would be the big white grape. Not that they aren't doing Chardonnay and other things too. And when you think of New Zealand, everyone thinks of Sauvignon Blanc and Pinot Noir, which is not the only thing they do. And we'll talk about that based on a regionality thing, but also New Zealand, I mean, both are islands. New Zealand's a far smaller country. It is much more of an island with water influence everywhere you go. So I think that plays a lot of part. And the grapes that are normal. I mean, if you're in the North Island, you will find Bordeaux varieties. You will find Cabernet, a lot of Cabernet and Merlot. But first of all, if they do Syrah, they call it Syrah, not Shiraz. So, but it's not as dominant there. Yeah.
That is a common misconception. And I myself have also thought, oh, what's the difference between those two countries? But just because they're close to each other and, are both New World wines, we have really a lot of exciting stuff to tell you about New Zealand next, which will make you completely separate those two thoughts from one another.
It's an even cooler climate, right, Allison?
I was just gonna say, it's much colder.
Amazing.
Yeah. You have a few warmer areas like on the southern Gimlet Gravels, which is in the southern part of the North Island where the Cabernet came out, is a warmer area. But yeah, your island influence everywhere you are. And it's just and the winds, oh my God, it's magnificent. I thought Australia was beautiful, and then I went to New Zealand.
Kim, have you been there? It sounds like you're like nodding, like you know exactly what you're talking about.
We honeymooned there, Australia and New Zealand. And New Zealand is like our dream. Like if I could move there, I would be gone.
100%.
If we didn't have family here, we'd be gone. It's like you said, absolutely beautiful. And I have a story of we spent like an entire afternoon with a winemaker in New Zealand, like hanging off a cliff because like that's where his winery was. And it was about screw tops versus corks, but Eddie told me I have to save it for the New Zealand night, so I'll save it.
I'll tell you a funny story about Australia wine, because we're still in Australia. I went to Australia before I ever worked in the wine industry. I was working in the .com world, and I took a trip to Australia for a significant birthday. No, that was New Zealand I went significant. Australia was earlier. Now I have my friend Kathy who left, we have friends that are Australian who got married in Australia. And I had gone to one wedding, and then 9 years later, I went to another wedding. So I've been twice. And the first time I went to Australia, I was working in the tech world. I had just started taking some classes on wine. I knew very little. I was not there to wine taste. And I was down on Kangaroo Island, which is, there was a lot of destruction with the fires last year, but Kangaroo Island is this amazing island that there was one hotel and it was kangaroos wandering freely. And then they had these night bobbies or some weird thing that you could go, some weird bird or something that you could see at night. So I was sitting at dinner by myself at the one hotel. Like, do you know where I'm talking about, Kim?
No, sorry, our son was showing us his like random project.
No, I was gonna say, I was down on this island, I was all by myself and I'm eating dinner by myself because that's what you do when you travel by yourself. And there's this huge table behind me of men and women laughing hysterically. And I don't think anything of it. And I go back and I asked the server if I could get my dessert as part of my meal because I had to get out to go on a night tour. And suddenly this dapper looking man walks up to me and he says, "What are you doing?" And I said, "Waiting for my dessert." He's like, "You're all alone?" And I said, "Yeah." And he goes, "You should join us." And I'm like, "Join who?" And he points to the table. And I said, "You're like 15 people. Like, I'm not going to walk up and invite myself to sit at your table." And he's like, "Oh, we're all friends. We're all the vineyard managers of for Muldara Bloss, which is a huge company that owns a bunch of vineyards." He's like, "When you come back from your tour, drink with us at the bar." And I was like, okay. So I come back to the bar. They're all there. Most of the women had gone to sleep. So it was all these men. And this older guy, Vic, starts talking to me and he goes, what are you doing tomorrow? And I said, I'm going to go spend a day in Melbourne because I have one day and then I'm back off to go somewhere else. He goes, no, you should come with us. We're going wine tasting and visiting some of our properties in McLaren Vale. And I'm like, okay, are you guys going to kill me? Because I don't know who you are. Like, I'm supposed to fly out of Kangaroo Island, land in, Melbourne, spend a day and then fly off. And you're telling me to take the ferry with you and hop in a car with like 15 strangers. Life was so good like 15 years ago.
Yeah.
No, so I even said to the hotel, I'm like, are these people legitimate? Like he says he works from some company I've never heard of. I didn't work in the wine business. I knew nothing. And I ended up that next day meeting them all, taking the ferry, hopping in their cars. We went to lunch at a vineyard. They took me wine tasting and they dropped me off my hotel at the end of the day. And like, that was my first wine experience in Australia, my only wine experience in Australia.
It's such a cool culture out there. Just that people are, it kind of feels like it's 15 years ago out there. New Zealand. Yeah,
It's been 9 years.
it has been. It's been a long time since we've been there, to be fair. Yeah.
New
But
Zealand,
that's
the same
cool.
thing. Like New Zealand, they invite you to their home. There aren't a lot of restaurants in New Zealand if you're out of the cities. So when I was there visiting, winemakers just took me into their homes because that's what they do. So
Well, that was the winery. We showed up at the tasting. He was closing early because nobody was there. And we're like, oh, that's okay. We'll just go. He was like, no. Let me unlock the door. And he stood there for 2 hours just talking to us.
Yeah.
We were the only people in the room. But I was gonna say, since we talked about aging on a screw top, we brought a Pinot Noir back from New Zealand and he said age it 5 to 10 years. So we said, okay, we're gonna save it for our 5th anniversary. But then I think I was pregnant or had just had a child or something. So we opened it this year in quarantine and drank it, and it was delicious after 8 years. 8 years.
Not that child, the other child.
I don't know which child.
Yeah. And if you guys stick around for the New Zealand week, I'll tell you the story of getting a speeding ticket in New Zealand.
We're going to have Story Corner. We're going to get through the tasting, and then this is going to be a new part of our class series as everyone comes with a
Card and
story.
corner, the card and corner where they tell you.
We do have a relevant screw top story about like how they got started in screw tops. I swear it's relevant.
You're going to be part of the class. We're going to give you the syllabus at the beginning.
Well, I look forward to hearing the story.
It was interesting. It was very interesting. Again, we talked to this man for like an entire afternoon. It was amazing.
I was gonna say, I'm really excited for New Zealand because I was introduced, like my wine story is the first time I ever had a bottle that I loved was Kim Crawford. Like old Kim Crawford though, like when Crawford was still the winemaker.
Because you're old enough.
Because my husband says because I'm old enough for that. Thank you.
He sold it and made a lot of money, and now they have a winery called Love
Yes,
Block.
we love
Love Block is great.
We love, yes. But so my first wine, I was like 21 and I had Kim Crawford in Maui at Chemo's for anyone who's been to Maui, like in Lahaina. And it was so amazing. So for me, New Zealand Sauvignon Blanc is like the wine that made me like wine. And so I'm so excited, but now I can't really drink a lot of those. And well,
I have a story that I will start next week about New Zealand Sauvignon Blanc. And I will say that without jumping too ahead into that, when I first got into wine, I too was a New Zealand Sauvignon Blanc drinker. And I have a couple friends who knew me in my tech world, laid off, 99, 2000. Or I should say, 99, who knew me that before I got into wine, and their palates have all been developed by me because we started with New Zealand Sauvignon Blanc and we went to Brachetto di Acqui, which Jerry didn't know me then, but has had some Brachetto and evolved. And from there, by learning about acidity, the whole world's open to you. Because my friend Jerry, when we met 10 years ago, wasn't a wine drinker, and now she can polish off a bottle in a night. So you guys can unmute. I feel so odd.
oh no, sorry. Our daughter is yelling at us about her gold shoes. But thank you. Yes, I'm so excited for next week.
And I'm really happy that you didn't get kidnapped.
Me too.
I'm a social worker, and I heard a story about like how I ran off with this man, and it went like really poorly, and I was like, oh geez. So when you were telling the story, I was like,
there are so many scary things like when you think about it, and I don't know, I mean, it was naivety, but we lived in a different time and it was a different place. I used to be really trusting of people. Now I trust people.
Well, and most of the time that trustingness works out. Like that's how you discover things is, trusting. And I just have a job where you hear about like, and this is when it went wrong. I have good trusting too. We talk about trust, but
we all live in COVID times. I trust no one anymore. Everyone.
No. No one. No. I would trust somebody in New Zealand though. I would totally hop in someone's car in New Zealand. They have no problem.
Right now, right this second.
They don't want us in their car, Stacey. They're like, stay away.
It's okay. They would like put me out of the car. They're like, no, you got it. Sorry.
So other than Kim and Eddie, has anyone else been to Australia?
No, just New Zealand.
Melanie and Ryan. Okay. And what about New Zealand?
New Zealand. I rode horses across New Zealand.
Wow.
So I haven't seen a lot of the things that you're supposed to see when you go to New Zealand because it was on horseback in the back country.
Right.
So I spent 3 weeks in New Zealand. I came back and everyone I worked with was, how was Milford Sound? I said, well, we didn't go there.
Well, don't worry.
How was this?
Don't worry, because I tried to go and I couldn't because the weather changes. And so I tried 2 days in a row and they canceled both times and that was that.
Yeah. But we rode all through some, we spent a week on a station across the lake, giant lake from Queenstown, where they had 3 guys who ran all the cattle and sheep with a bunch of dogs. And then we spent another week on a farm somewhere. And we spent a week riding through some mountains somewhere where they took us and the river was higher that we had to cross. Oh, the river's a lot higher than we thought it would be. Okay, well, if anyone gets swept off their horse, try to grab their tail.
Well, Australia.
New Zealand was just beautiful, and I felt like it was, I mean, this was quite a while ago, like early 1990. I felt like it was a total throwback to the 50s. It was such a nice, and it was such a beautiful country.
Yeah, Australia is really, really beautiful. And if you've been, you know that it's gorgeous. And then you step into New Zealand, and New Zealand was like the kind of place I drove through the whole country my first time there. And I remember I was driving down the road and I would stop and I go, that is the most beautiful view. And I take a picture. Pictures don't do justice to how beautiful it is. And then it got so bad that I literally was driving with my camera and I would just take pictures as I was driving, not looking, because I was like, I wanted to capture the beauty. It's because there are no clouds in the sky. So when you see blue forever, forever. It's just magnificent. So anyway, 2 weeks from now, we'll talk about that.
All right, guys. I think this is the time.
Thank you.
Thank you guys so much for hanging out for this long. We will see you in 2 weeks from today on the 29th. We will be in our New Zealand gear with our New Zealand wine. I will not attempt a New Zealand accent because no one will come back and patronize my store anymore. But we are so excited. Thank you so much for getting all 3 of the classes for this series. It's going to be so great, and enjoy the rest of your wine. Happy Friday.
Bye.
Thank you.
Bye.
This was just what I needed after like 2 weeks of life.
Have you been busy, Melanie?
I've been very, very, very busy.
In the news cycle?
What?
Has anything happened in the news?